Thank you, Justin. So good afternoon again, friends. My name is Jim Cason, and I have the privilege of working for all of you at the Friends Committee on National Legislation on policy and advocacy work. I am joined here today by Amelia Kegan, who I can see on the screen there, she's waving, who's our domestic policy. She runs our domestic policy lobbying, and also by Justin Hurdle, who does a lot of our data work and also is our go-to guy for scheduling lobby visits. As I look around this room, I can see so many faces I know, as well as lots of people that I'm not sure I remember right now. So many of you are already working with us on advocacy teams to end US support for the Saudi war in Yemen, on Call to Conscience, part of our young adults program, part of our War is Not the Answer effort. So I want to start just by saying thank you. Thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your financial support. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, just as we're beginning for Congress what is an April recess. Our agenda today is pretty simple. I'm going to talk a little bit about the moment, the congressional recess. This is the opportunity we see. And we're really privileged to have Amelia Kegan joining us with a report from Capitol Hill of what's happening. Amelia leads a lot of the key coalitions working on what we see as really the most important opportunity we have. And then we're going to talk briefly about getting back into congressional offices. For those of you who know me, I'm a person who likes to physically go to congressional offices, and we're seeing opportunities to begin to do that. So that's our focus. We're going to have a lot of time for questions, but we want to make sure that we really use the next couple of weeks to our best advantage. And as some of you have heard me say, we're here today because of your power. The huge investments, the unprecedented investments that the FCNL community has made in creating peace building funds, to the Native American program that was supportive of and engaged on passing VAWA that just happened. I was talking to our environmental lobbyist recently, Clarence, and he noted that a lot of the things the Advocacy Corps was lobbying on in terms of environmental justice are part of the Biden administration's proposal for spending for the next year. So how we frame the issues, how we bring our voices into these offices really can make a difference. And today, we're talking about the recess. Congress is out now. They're not back in Washington until April 25th. So there's really 2 full weeks. Probably they won't actually come back until Tuesday. We're also hearing that members of Congress are starting to reopen their offices. And so that's the opportunity we see right now. It's a chance to set the stage for work that that we think Congress will do in the next couple of months. Many of you who part of the FCNL community know that we've worked on this reconciliation bill that Amelia will talk about for a long time. I personally thought it was pretty much dead, that it wasn't going anywhere a couple of months ago. But Amelia has been keeping her eye on this and says that the effort is being revived. There is a real interest in getting the climate provisions and some of the tax breaks and some of the revenue portions of it passed. But the question is, what's actually going to be in the bill? And will it be the investments that we want, that we think the country needs? Will they make the investments in children and families to meet the moment? Will there be an opportunity to actually continue the historic investments that our country has begun to make in trying to address persistent poverty in this country and address the climate crisis? And of course, if you are lobbying on something else, we want you also to take that issue into congressional offices. And we'll come back to the specifics, the mechanics about how to get into congressional offices in a minute. But I want to turn it over to Amelia now. Amelia, can you let us know what's happening on the Hill? Why is this such an important moment for advocacy?
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It is really great to see all of your faces on the screen and names, and just want to really affirm Jim's gratitude and thanks for so much work that so many of you have done for some of you for many years on advocacy and working for justice. So as Jim was saying, by reading the news, you might think that nothing is happening in Washington, right? Build Back Better Act, which many of us have been lobbying on very strongly, that died in December. We're in an election year. It's so partisan and polarized on Capitol Hill. You might feel like it's hopeless, but I'm really here to tell you that that is not the situation right now. The White House and leadership in both the House and the Senate, they are gearing up for what's going to be a major push on a big climate and economic spending bill, what we're calling the reconciliation bill. It's pretty much a reimagined from Build Back Better. This is not Build Back Better, but congressional leaders and the White House are looking at a couple components from that legislation to package together and pass in the coming months. And since they're going to use the budget reconciliation process, which is why we're calling it the reconciliation bill, it's only going to need 50 votes to pass the Senate. So I'll just say I have been on multiple calls with senior members of White House staff talking with multiple congressional offices. And that's what I'm hearing, right? They are really intent on getting something done. And Senator Manchin has even come out and said, it's really time to put pen to paper and get this legislation done. So one of our challenges is that if you're reading the news, this isn't being reported a lot. And that is in some ways intentional. If you'll remember back in December, all the negotiations, all the play-by-plays, that was all happening out in the press, and it really backfired. And so there's a really conscious effort to try and keep the negotiations and what's happening in this legislation sort of out of the news. So what I want to say is, just because you're not reading a lot is happening doesn't mean nothing is happening. There are conversations that are happening right now quietly behind the scenes, and we really expect things to pick up during the April recess. So there's so much I want to share with you, but I'm going to try and be tight because we really want to get to questions and hear from all of you. But let me just go over sort of what do we think is on the table? What could be in this package? First, it's going to be climate, tax fairness, and drug pricing is really the bulk of the package. On climate, we're looking at clean energy incentives, investments in environmental justice. We're talking about tax incentives for solar, wind, geothermal, as well as energy storage, energy efficiency programs, electric vehicles, those sorts of things. And then a lot on kind of making our tax code more fair, ensuring wealthier individuals and corporations pay their fair share, as well as bringing down drug pricing costs. But that's not it. There's still a real strong chance that there could be a couple other things included in that package. And I'm just going to run through them, and then I want to focus a bit on where we are in the child tax credit. There's a strong chance of including some really important healthcare provisions, both around the Affordable Care Act premiums, and then also what we call the Medicaid coverage gap, ensuring that people who don't have access to Medicaid can get access to it. And then also some possibility on childcare, and then home and community-based services. But I do want to say that there continues to be a strong push, particularly from our champions on the Hill, to try and get extending the child tax credit into this legislation. It's still going to be an uphill climb, but we're really pushing hard to see what we can do. There still remains just enormous support for the child tax credit in the Democratic caucus. And right now, every member of Congress wants to prioritize addressing inflation. And if we want to provide relief for families trying to deal with higher costs, the child tax credit is one of the most effective immediate ways that we can do that. Right? There was this recent report that came from Moody's Analytics, and it says that inflation is costing the average family in the United States an additional $296 per month. That is basically the same amount of one of the monthly child, 1 month of the expanded child tax credit for one child. So if you want to provide relief for families who are facing higher costs, like the child tax credit is the easiest and most effective and most immediate ways to do that. So let me quickly go through the timeline. Again, we're really looking at the April recess to Memorial Day as key dates. What we have heard is that they really want to get something through the Senate by Memorial Day. Now that could slip. It's a very ambitious timeline, but we're operating with that time frame right now. And so that's why the April recess is so critical. And right now, they haven't made any decisions of what is definitely in or definitely out of the package. So you have a real role to play in helping shape what this legislation looks like and to help get it passed. You know, there is no guarantee that this is going to get through the finish line. So this is really the prime time for advocacy. We're saying sort of the drop dead date to get this done is the August recess. If it's not done by August, given the midterms, it's hard to see this passing. And I would say this is an important message for every member of Congress to hear, right? This package might pass with, you know, on mostly Democratic votes, but every member of Congress needs to hear about the importance of these climate provisions. Every member of Congress needs to hear about the importance of extending the child tax credit. No one should be off the hook for these key priorities for our country. So I think I'll stop there. Happy to address, I know there are a lot of other questions, happy to address, you know, there's been a lot in the news about inflation and how that might, this might impact that, but really want to hear from you and just really encourage you all to do what you can in this critical time.
So start thinking about those questions or even posting them in the chat if you have them. But before we go to that, I'm the mechanics guy, so I'm always looking for, okay, if you were going to do something, which we hope all of you do in the next 2 weeks, what is it that you would do? And I would say, take a lead from our young adults from Spring Lobby Weekend, because we just had this amazing Spring Lobby Weekend in Washington, D.C. And half the meetings that we had here in Washington, D.C. were in person. We're with a congressional staff person or a member of Congress. So we had almost 100 meetings, I think it was, Justin, and half of them were in person. What we're hearing anecdotally is that congressional offices around the country are beginning to open. And what happened in DC was we were actually some of the first people to have constituents going into congressional offices. And now we're hoping that you all will consider going into a congressional office, or if they're not yet open, calling them up and saying, hey, I'd love to come by. If they say they're not open, then I'd love to have a conversation with that district office about these issues. Really important. I think Justin can put in some links. The mechanics of this is go to your member of Congress's website. We've been trying to figure out what are those addresses. Well, they keep changing, particularly with COVID and the pandemic. The addresses change. So go to your member of Congress's website, look up the office that's closest to you. If you can't find it, call the office and say, hey, what's the office closest to me? If they tell you the office is closed, say, okay, then I'd like to have a conversation on the phone or by Zoom about these issues, which I know are pending in Congress. Who is there that I might be able to talk to? If you're going in person, think about something, and I know that Bob Schultz and other people on the call might remember this. One of the suggestions we had back probably a dozen years ago was bring a flower, welcome them back to being in person. Think about these are folks that are just beginning to go back into their own offices to work out of their offices. How do you make this a welcoming event? Something where you've heard this from me a million times, you're building a relationship with that office as they're reopening. And specifically then we have, and I know Justin will put the links in the chat, we have a leave behind we'd love for you to take in that pretty much summarizes a lot of the stuff that Amelia said in her presentation, really putting the fine points on to the opportunity we see around climate change, the opportunity we see particularly around this child tax credit. That, to summarize, we believe Congress will do something on reconciliation. And the question is what? And your visits are what's going to help us shape what Congress actually does. Obviously, we would like you to also make sure when you go in that if you drop by that office, make sure that you have a pen, that you write your name and your address on that leave behind when you leave it at the front desk if you're not able to actually get an appointment, and ask for an appointment. If you've got questions, Justin is here and is able to answer those questions while we're on the phone. We'll also send you a follow-up email after this conversation is over with a way for you to follow up. You can also email lobby@fcnl.org and Justin or someone else will follow up. I think that rather than talking some more, let's go to questions. We said we wanted to get to questions quickly. I think we're going to go until about 20 minutes to 5 our local time. I don't know what time it is for you. I see we have some questions now. What about lobbying senators and not only House members? And if so, what to tell retiring Senator Pat Toomey? Amelia.
Yeah, well, these are great questions. I would say, again, the focus is really going to be in the Senate, but all members need to hear this message. And, I think when you're talking to the difference between Democratic offices or Republican offices, the reconciliation bill, like when we were advocating on Build Back Better, we're not expecting Republicans to necessarily vote for the reconciliation bill, but we really do need their support for the climate policies and for the child tax credit. And particularly, like, I can speak specifically to the child tax credit. If it doesn't get in the reconciliation package, we still, like, on all of these things, we are still going to continue to press, and we're going to need ultimately bipartisan support to get these priorities through. So you think about the child tax credit and the reach of that policy and the fact that it expired. No member of Congress should be off the hook for letting that policy expire. And so going into those offices and saying, listen, this is a really important policy. It had, in the month that after that expired, 3.7 million kids fell into poverty because of that expansion expiring. So talking about kind of just the need for them to extend the expanded child tax credit, the same thing on the climate policies. Like, we have waited way too long for robust congressional action on the climate. And so I think coming in and to talking about the importance of those policies, every member of Congress needs to hear that. And we're going to continue to follow all the different opportunities throughout the year to continue to make progress on both of these priorities.
Thanks, Amelia. And again, you can post your questions in the chat, or if you would like to ask a question and you have the ability, you can go down to the bottom. There's a more button and you can actually raise your hand, and then Justin and I will be able to see your hand raised and we can recognize you. Amelia, I think I'm going to ask you to say a little bit more about the child tax credit, because I think it wasn't always obvious to me. Well, okay, I get it, this child tax credit, we like it, but what did it do during that 6 months when it was in effect in 2021 that was so transformational? If you could just give us a couple more sentences there, because I think some folks on the line might not actually understand the ways in which it helped, particularly the people who are some of the poorest people and some of the people of color in this country who are often left out of these programs.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Jim, and love you teeing that up the question, because I love to talk about the child tax credit. So yeah, in the American Rescue Plan that was passed in March, Congress expanded the child tax credit so that all families, regardless of income, before you had to earn a certain amount of money before you could get the child tax credit, got the full child tax credit, and they made it much larger. And then they made it monthly. So starting in July, families on the 15th of the month started to get either $300 for each kid they had under the age of 6, or $250 for kids 6 to 18. And that made a huge difference I mean, we saw the data of 4.1 million kids lifted above the poverty line. We saw just anecdotal stories of families across the country of what that extra income meant for them, of being able to afford, dentist visits, of diapers, of just everything across the spectrum. And then one of the biggest things that it did was in addressing racial disparities. So it really significantly reduced the difference in the child poverty rates between the gap between white households and Black and Hispanic households. So just it was this transformative policy that we had, and it is so rare that Congress enacts a policy and that we see the results and impact so immediately. And we did that for 6 months. We had this experiment and we saw how incredibly successful this policy was. And then we saw in January, when it expired, just the numbers of 3.7 million kids falling back below the poverty line. So I think there's a lot of data out there that shows just how powerful that policy really is. And projections are that if we were to keep that in place, it would cut child poverty rates by nearly 40%, which is huge.
Thanks, Amelia. And I know that you're passionate about that. And I also know that that sometimes I hear in our community, well, do these government programs work? And here's a program where we actually have a modern day experiment. Did this work? Well, there's a lot of evidence, and you don't have to go to FCNL to find it, that actually this did work, that for the period of time this was in place, it actually had a tremendous impact on the number of people living in poverty, particularly children living in poverty. Bunch of other questions coming in, and I don't want to forget that we had somebody ask about Senator Toomey. We've also got questions about, is it worth, again, focusing at all on Republicans? I heard you say, and I think that is still important, that actually getting those Republican voices out, even if it is a retiring senator from Ohio or from Pennsylvania, is going to make a difference. That in a way we're creating political space here for folks to move ahead with this. I expect, Amelia is always much more couched than I am. I expect that they're going to pass something. The question again is, are they going to make the kinds of investments that really are needed right now, the kinds of investments that really could make a difference? I want to just see if someone has a question they'd like to ask verbally, unmute or raise your hand if you can down at the bottom. I also want to just highlight, we have a series of questions. Mary asks a question about tax credits for solar as one approach. Is there any grant funding possible for low-income people? I don't know, Amelia, if you know that, or I see Rosalie's on the line as well, that perhaps she knows an answer to this.
So I believe that there is kind of some funding in there to try and make renewable energy and access to that much more accessible. But Rosalie, you are one of our climate experts, so I turn it over to you, and happy to have you take this one.
Yes, hello all. Thanks. If you aren't familiar with me, my name is Rosalie Reitz. I'm the Program Assistant for Sustainable Energy and Environment this year. And that is a very important question about tax credits, but also grant funding for low-income folks. So part of the climate package of reconciliation is largely about tax credits, but there is also a very important piece for environmental justice provisions, including grants, just like what you're asking about. In the House version of the Build Back Better bill, which includes all the climate provisions that we are asking them to keep in whatever reconciliation package they're able to come up with, they had set aside $29 billion for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator, which has funding including $8 billion specifically for low-income communities. So I think this is speaking to your question, is that yes, there is funding for that within the environmental justice provisions of the bill, and it is just as important to advocate and say we need to keep these environmental justice provisions in there because the tax credits alone are not going to cut it, right? They are a huge, very important step, but there is still more to be done. So I hope I was able to speak to that question, and I'm going to share a link in the chat that has more detailed breakdown of the environmental justice provisions that we're advocating for. So yeah.
Thanks, Rosalie. Very glad that you're on the call with us. I see that Phil has a question from New York, I think. Phil, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. I live in New York, so my senators Gillibrand and Schumer are usually on board with what I'm asking for, and my representative, Elise Stefanik, is pretty reliably against anything that I'm interested in. But I find if I try to go to other senators or representatives' websites, oftentimes when they see my zip code, I can't get through to them. So is there any way out of this quandary? It does irritate me that I get fund appeals for Democrats all over the country, but they don't really want to hear from me except get my money. I'll go on mute. And
Great question, Phil. I think, yeah, you raise something that I think is important. So I'll do two parts of that. That is, one is, even if you think your members of Congress are with you, they still need to hear from you, because it doesn't mean that they're going to prioritize the things that we want them to prioritize. They might say, yes, I support these things, but when push comes to shove and you have to make difficult choices of what gets in this package or what it doesn't, what are you going to be speaking out to? You know, those who aren't in leadership, what are you going to be going to Schumer and saying, this absolutely has to be in the package? And then, you know, Schumer, who is the leader, you know, he's going to be making a lot of the decisions. You know, he's in a pretty powerful position. So don't assume that just because your members of Congress say, oh, I support this or I'm with you, doesn't necessarily mean that they are championing or really prioritizing what we're asking them to prioritize. So I would say that first. The second is, yeah, it's true. It's you're going to be most effective by going to your members of Congress. They want to hear from their constituents. A lot of times, if you try and reach out to other offices, they'll try and redirect you to your own members. But you're going to be most effective talking to those who represent you. So yeah, I can understand, you know, the way that the fundraising works, they'll take dollars from anyone, but in terms of advocacy, it's usually best to go to your own members.
Well, and I want to go to Justin in a second because he organizes a lot of our lobbying here, but I will just underline that actually, Phil, I'm envious of you in some ways because you have Senator Schumer as your senator. I literally was on the phone with the chief counsel for one of the most important other Democratic senators in the Senate last week. And he said to me, if you can't get Senator Schumer to support the part of that bill that you want, then it isn't going to happen. And you really have to, he used the word nail him down. Now, I think that's probably a little violent for a Quaker organization, but at least to get a commitment around these provisions, and not just a couple $100 billion, but actually the full $500 billion on climate, really important. A lot of that could slip, and this child tax credit. Senator Schumer is going to have a huge impact on this. Justin, what do you find when you go into offices?
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thanks, Amelia. Phil, real quick, I just wanted to chime in. I worked for Senator Schumer for a year or so, and anyone else from New York, if you don't know, the senator loves reading the newspaper. One thing that we are going to include in our follow-up email is a really easy way for folks to write and submit a letter to the editor. Senator Schumer prefers to be in the Middlebury Times, the Watertown Daily News. He prefers those over the New York Times and the New York Post, even though the New York Post is his favorite paper. So one thing that I always tell people in this situation is use those media opportunities, but also a lot of us, you know, move around throughout our years. I have plenty of friends in Illinois where I grew up, in New York where I went to school, and now I'm down here in Virginia and DC. So if you have members who are very supportive, you think it's not worth it, but you are from somewhere, or you have family, friends, others who are concerned about these issues, perhaps you have family who benefit from the child tax credit, but haven't been for these past 4 months, reach out to the folks in your network who are in those states, encourage them. Forward the email that we're going to send you later today or tomorrow with that follow-up information. Getting that in front of people is really important, and getting it in those offices to know that you're paying attention going into an election year is also really important. So I hope that's helpful, Phil.
Thanks, Justin. And I want to go, Margaret has a question, but before I do that in the chat, I do want to just say, don't forget the action out of this. We want to talk about the legislation, but we would really love to see each of you pick up the phone. This is not a telethon, but pick up the phone and call your local congressional office. See if they're open. See if they're open a couple of days a week that you could stop by and both welcome them back and then let them know of your concern on this issue. We're hoping that this is the beginning of getting back into building those relationships with individuals in these offices as a step to both move this legislation and also continue to build these relationships. So Margaret asks, Amelia, I think this is for you. Can you appeal to conservatives and Republicans by saying the child tax credit creates a maximum of benefit with a minimum of your bureaucracy? And then asks about IRS funding. What do you think, Amelia?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a key talking point among conservatives for sure. A good one. Yeah, there's the administrative cost for the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit are pretty much are very, very small compared to many of our other assistance programs. So that is, and the other thing is, because it can be turned on immediately, right? The IRS has just kind of implemented this so they can turn it on immediately. So those are two kind of really good arguments, I think, or points to make with conservative offices. And certainly IRS funding, I mean, the IRS needs more funding generally. In the last, I believe in the last spending package, they did make some increases for that. And certainly President Biden has proposed providing more funding for the IRS. But part of the funding that certainly, if you're going to fund the IRS, more funding to help with taxpayer assistance, and certainly VITA programs that do volunteer income tax assistance preparation to help individuals file their taxes and be able to claim these benefits. So that's a separate ask, but it is an important one. But certainly the child tax credit, there are we could spend all day talking about all the benefits of the child tax credit and why both it should appeal to both liberals and conservatives.
Thanks, Amelia. And I also want to go to Brad's question. Do we have time to speak to FCNL's efforts to end the war in Yemen? As I said at the beginning, there are many issues that you can lobby Congress on, and we want you to follow your passion. We're going to give you the best advice we can provide you about what is moving right now. And this work on the reconciliation package we see as really, really important. A second issue that is also vital that we think is particularly vital right now is efforts to end US support for the Saudi war in Yemen. There is a ceasefire that has started in Yemen right now. We've heard from some of the folks close to the ceasefire that it was, again, the renewed action in Congress and by the Biden administration that helped push both parties to believe that this is a moment for a ceasefire. And our program with the advocacy teams has been focused on a war powers resolution, which we expect to be introduced in the House probably when Congress comes back at the end of this month, that would specifically try to end US support for the Saudi war in Yemen. And so a great opportunity also during the break to raise that issue and take that issue into congressional offices. Amelia, well, I want to say one other thing before I go back to Amelia, but and please feel free, if you don't know how to raise your hand, just unmute and let me know and I'll recognize you if you have a question that you would like to ask. I do want to just keep pushing this notion that it's pretty easy to download the leave behind or look for it in the email that we follow up this conversation with, and then print that out and take that into that congressional office. Doesn't even take that long and really could make a difference. So I hope you'll consider doing that. Amelia, I did want to ask you just a little bit more about inflation, because we hear a lot about inflation. There were some new numbers out. What's the answer when my member of Congress says, well, more government spending, we're just going to get more inflation? What do I say?
Right, and that's certainly a valid question that a lot of people are asking. Well, I would say, this package, we wouldn't expect it to contribute to inflation, because first of all, this is not just going to be a climate bill and a healthcare and hopefully child tax credit bill, but it is also a deficit reduction bill. One of the things that Senator Manchin has asked is that if you have, say, a $1.8 trillion package, that actually half of that will be going to deficit reduction. So it's actually going to reduce the deficits in the next 10 years, which means you're not going to be contributing to inflation. The other piece is, the child tax credit overall is relatively small compared to the share of the economy. And so that in and of itself is not really contributing to inflation and some of the inflationary pressures. And one of the most, there are a number of other things. I mean, a lot of the assistance that Congress has given out over the past couple of years in response to COVID, that's expiring and ending. And so for all of those reasons, this package in and of itself, we do not expect to really be contributing to any additional inflationary pressures, but it could provide enormous relief and assistance to people who are facing higher prices. So for those reasons, it's a good package to be passing right now.
Okay, I promised Amelia we'd wrap up in a few minutes, so I want to keep my promise, but I want to go to Justin first. Justin, again, organizes hundreds of lobby visits every year for many of you and all of our folks, and so he knows these offices pretty well. What can people expect coming out of this?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And thanks again, everyone, for spending some of your day wherever you're calling in from. It's the 4 o'clock coming up on the 5 o'clock hour here in DC. So thank you for helping us end our workday in this is exciting. This is really great. We're looking forward to hearing how the next 2 weeks over this recess go. So you all will receive an email later today. I've been putting a bunch of links in the chat. I know, it's Zoom, we're all virtual, but I don't expect you to open all those tabs at once. We'll put that in the email for you, so it's nice in one place. We'll have the leave behind that you can print out and drop off at an office. We'll include a link to a drop-by visit checklist and sample script, just in case you haven't done this before, or you want to I'm very methodical. Jim and I love checklists and step-by-step instructions. So that's there for you. And that might also be a good thing to share with someone else. If they're nervous or haven't done this before, but you want to bring them along, that's a good way to bring folks into advocacy, which we're always in favor of. And lastly, we will include a link to what I mentioned earlier to Phil, a link to our website where you can use our talking points and submit a letter to the editor to your local, regional, and I think some national papers if you'd like. That's, again, a great way to get this message in front of those members of Congress. So keep an eye out for that email later today. And then this will be in the email as well. I am always reachable. Our organizing team is always reachable at lobby@fcnl.org. We want to hear your questions. We want to hear how your visits go. We want to hear what issues you want to work on, and we can be helpful as much as we can. Thanks, Jim, for putting that in there. And thank you all again for coming. I look forward to hearing from you.
So thanks, Justin. I'm going to say a couple things and go to Amelia for a closing for us. What we're finding sometimes is you go to congressional offices and they kind of throw up their hands and say, well, it's not up to me, it's up to the leadership. And or it's up to somebody else other than my office. Well, what we know from the negotiations is that what becomes a priority is what the leadership hears from individual members that they believe is a priority. They're hearing that some climate investment is important. There's a danger that it won't be the climate investment that Rosalie and Clarence have identified for us, but that it'll be less, or it'll have less of the environmental justice provisions that we really think are vital at this moment. And frankly, although I think Amelia has a more positive thing, we're hearing that the child tax credit is in trouble, that it is going to be hard to get that done. And as a faith community, this is one of our most important priorities, and something that we believe our voices could help to make sure that Congress doesn't miss this opportunity to do this. And calling people back to that opportunity right now, and asking every member of Congress to speak out publicly and ask the leadership to support this child tax credit. We have very conservative offices and very liberal offices saying this is a good thing. So let's get the politics out of the way and actually get this done. And that in some sense, I think that's our superpower. More than anything else, as a faith community, is bringing our values into these offices and letting members of Congress, letting their staff know that we're with them to try to make these important investments. And that we can give you all the facts, all the figures, but what's in your heart, what your values are, what your faith leads you to do, that's the most important thing. And that's the voice we hope you'll bring back into these congressional offices. So over to you, Amelia.
I think you said it so well, Jim. Just like, this is such a prime time. So whatever you are able to do in the next couple weeks, I think will really help shape the conversation. I hear from my coalition partners and from folks on the Hill just repeatedly, just the ask to get folks around the country to be reaching out to their members of Congress on this. I agree with Jim. It's gonna be a challenging, it's a challenge to get all the priorities we want in this legislation. But like, gosh, we're gonna try as hard as we can and gonna continue to press as much as possible to make sure that this legislation shapes out the best that we can possibly shape it out. So, and you are key to getting that. This is the moment to do that. So just really thank you for all that you do, and please reach out. We are here to help you be successful in your advocacy. So whatever we can do to help you do that, let us know. This is a partnership that we're working together to try and get this done.
Thank you all, and we'll follow up.
Thanks, everyone.